I am pleased to welcome Dr. Angelo Codevilla, Professor of International Relations at Boston University. His background brings a wealth of experience on the subject of his presentation, Diplomacy and War. He has served as a senior staff member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and a U.S. Foreign Service officer. Dr. Codevilla, many books range from comparative government and political thought to the theory and practice of conflict, especially intelligence and missile warfare. There are a number of people currently in the news who should be in line to read his forthcoming book, Advice for War Presidents. Dr. Codevilla.
Thank you. I am the cleanup hitter, and my job is to, among other things, to keep you awake until dinner. My predecessor did an admirable job of keeping everyone awake after lunch. I hope I can do as well. I was asked to talk about diplomacy and war, the relationship between the two. I excuse myself for presuming to, as it were, talk about basic things, very, very basic things. Here I am speaking to giving teachers, as it were, the 101 lesson, fundamentals. But I believe that the difference between victory and defeat, success and failure, is often made by how well or badly we handle fundamentals. So what I'm going to be doing today is quite simply to explore the meaning of these two words, and especially to make sure that we understand what they do not mean, and as well as how they relate to each other. So bear with me. This is going to be. I hope it isn't going to be too terribly dry. It won't be nearly as juicy as what you heard before, but we'll do our best here. By nature, diplomacy and military force are means to the ends of statecraft. They're channels by which governments press their agendas onto others. Both words denote kinds of actions rather than the political substance of any given action. Diplomacy is a medium, verbally to communicate realities that may move nations, regardless of what is communicated and of the desired directions of movement. Hence, diplomacy is not to be confused with any particular message that diplomats may carry, or with its effects. These effects depend not on the words themselves, but on the realities that the message conveys. Military action, on the other hand, physically communicates the government's wishes by trying to sweep away resistance to them, regardless of what those wishes may be or of the relationship between those wishes and the military operations that follow. Whereas diplomacy represents realities, military operations create those realities. But to what end? Statecraft is about managing reality, coupling ends and means. It's about coupling ends and means in ways that advance a country's interests. Hence, just as diplomacy is not to be confused with policy, military action is not to be confused with war, and neither is to be confused with statecraft. Contemporary usage has distorted these words' meanings. Diplomacy is supposed popularly to be the peaceful alternative to war, but we all know that diplomacy is used as often to prepare war, and is always an important part of waging it. Often it makes the difference between victory and defeat. Almost always it ratifies the consequences. Diplomacy, in other words, is the verbal representation of coercive reality, compelling international realities. And military force is one of these realities. Conventionally, major military action is called war. But bombings and so-called boots on the ground are no more war than sex is love. The connection between ends and means is what determines the character of any actions. War is military operations tailored to achieve one's preferred peace. Here I hearken to St. Augustine's view that the reason for war is that people have different visions of peace. Now, everyone desires peace, his own peace, so much that he wages war on behalf of it. Indeed, there is no such thing as peace in general. There are only particular kinds of peace, each kind being secured by the capacity for war, or indeed by the actual waging and victory of a particular war. Unless military operations are crafted to achieve a particular objective, reasonably crafted, not simply it is not sufficient simply to desire, to wish that military operations achieve a particular objective. Unless the operations are reasonably crafted to achieve those objectives, they are quite literally senseless. The study of history helps us to see the fog of contemporary loose talk. Persons who know the meaning of words could not help but cringe at the U.S. Republican administration, which proclaimed after the 2006 Lebanon war that diplomacy had won. Equally meaningless and disconcerting was the statement of many Democrats that they would have dealt with the matter by using diplomacy more. This is utterly meaningless talk. Imagine two persons at odds. To understand diplomacy, imagine any two persons at odds over love, money, politics, religion, or what Shakespeare called the length of a straw. A friend might suggest, well, why don't we resolve this by diplomacy? I'll set up the meetings. Well, I suggest that unless someone could say at those meetings things that would make the differences between the parties less important than what they were at the beginning, the meetings would be counterproductive. If the difference remained important, why should either side accommodate the other's wishes? Perhaps the differences were not real, mere misunderstandings. Perhaps though real, they were small in comparison with other interests which either or both are willing to take as currency in exchange for giving up their claims. Perhaps new events have reduced the controversy's importance. Or one side may present to the other realities of which the other was not aware. But if either side does not present to the other anything new, why, both sides will be lucky if the meeting does not result in further conflict. John Quincy Adams, a student of statesmanship as well as a practitioner, believed that governments understand their own and others' interests quite well. His experience in diplomacy convinced him not that negotiations are superfluous, but rather that they ratify both sides' recognition of realities that exist, regardless of agreements or lack thereof. Diplomacy can make it more comfortable to live with reality by clarifying mutual understanding of reality, but it cannot change reality. Adams' magisterial notes on the reasons why he recommended that the United States spurn Britain's invitation in 1823 to join in opposition to any Franco-Spanish attempt to retake Spain's colonies in the Western Hemisphere, shows a fine appreciation for the fact that by joining Britain, by joining Britain in the Declaration, the United States would not have added anything to the known fact of parallel British and American opposition to this venture. In other words, the agreement would have been superfluous to reality. Had, in fact, the reality of parallel opposition not been there, a joint declaration would have been futile, you see. So the point is that diplomacy does not add to reality, nor indeed can it subtract from it. and one ought not to suppose otherwise. So, what are some of the parameters for the use of diplomacy? Almost 2 generations ago, Freddie Clay published How Nations Negotiate, a book widely used by diplomatic academies around the world. Too many of the graduates, however, especially Americans, forget its central teaching, expressed in a chapter titled The Continual Threefold Choice. The diplomat's first task is to figure out whether agreement is possible on the basis of what he calls, quote, the available terms. In short, whether both sides' objectives, though different, are compatible. Only if they are can negotiations proceed according to what Clay calls the rules of accommodation, namely making sincere proposals, abiding by partial agreements, etc. If the objectives are not compatible, the diplomats may choose to walk away or to negotiate for side effects. That is, to use the negotiations to undermine the other side's government, to sow dissension among the allies, deceive it, pocket partial concessions, renege on commitments, buy time, gather intelligence, etc. Now, the problem comes when one side proceeds in diplomatic contact following the rules of accommodation, proceeding as if agreement on the available terms were possible, while the other side uses the diplomatic table as a battlefield. Well, the point, of course, the imperative is to realize whether one is engaged in a mutual search for agreement or in a kind of battle. The history of U.S. diplomacy since World War II is in too large measure that of what happens when this judgment is made badly. Whether with regard to the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the Soviet Union, or the Middle East and North Korea in our time, the default U.S. modus operandi has been to consider diplomacy as an independent factor, and for our diplomats to treat all interlocutors as partners, and to treat negotiations as mutual good faith searches for agreement. Of course, this has permitted, even encouraged and rewarded America's adversaries to treat negotiations as instruments of conflict advantageously. Just as important, by validating the other side's bona fides, American diplomats have placed themselves in the awkward position of taking blame for the failure of negotiations to achieve objectives which they themselves had declared were at hand. The embarrassment of revoking certifications of bona fides gratuitously granted has pressed American diplomats preemptively to dismiss the option of walking away, fearing, quite correctly, that they would be blamed for that, since, after all, they themselves have not chosen to blame the other side. Again, because if they blamed the other side, people would ask them, well, why didn't you foresee this? Why did you tell us beforehand that these people were, in fact, partners? Thus, they end up valuing less the substance of any agreements than the appearance of agreement. The result has been not just the practice, but also the advocacy of international agreements that are no such thing. Henry Kissinger has done the most to promote, and in fact has come to exemplify this, and to legitimize this mode of diplomatic procedures. Most often, today's high-profile agreements are written purposely so that both sides may interpret them precisely as they wish. That is, precisely as if no negotiation had taken place. Dictionaries have a word for such things: charades. The question is, whom do these charades benefit? Whom do they disadvantage? I suggest to you that they clearly disadvantage governments that depend on public opinion and who publicly subscribe to the fiction that an agreement has taken place and a problem solved. They must realize that if and when, thenceforth, they take actions in response to the other side's undiminished pursuit of their goals, they thereby impeach their own competence, their own judgment, their own performance. Moreover, make-believe successes, such as Henry Kissinger's limiting of Soviet strategic arms in 1972, or ending the Vietnam War in 1973, are guaranteed to come a cropper and to turn into real defeats that cannot be spun away. That is why, and the case of North Korea these days illustrates this as well as any, diplomats have increasingly caveated their claims of agreements by adding the word framework. But what is a framework agreement? What is an agreement other than an agreement to agree? And everyone knows that an agreement to agree, in fact, advertises the fact that there is no agreement. Even more transparently unnatural are so-called agreements on processes, e.g., for example, disarmament processes and peace processes. You wanted disarmament and peace? You've got armament and war. But have you failed? Nah. You've succeeded in engaging the several parties in procedures that you say will overcome substantive intentions. They will do so in some undefined tomorrow. This amounts, of course, to casting thin veils over unpleasant realities. And this casting of thinly clothing unpleasant realities is not diplomacy. The ultimate in such see-through diplomatic garments is surely the 2005 agreement on the Bush administration's roadmap to Arab-Israeli peace. Here, policymakers and diplomats cannot manage to pretend that there is any agreement even on a diplomatic agenda, much less on the fundamental issues. But they tout agreement on ambiguously phrased interim goals as tracing the road to talks leading to a process. Now, as I say, a roadmap is yet one more instance removed from a process. So you've got process, so you have roadmaps to processes, to framework agreements, to agreements. I mean, this is this is like the dance of the seven veils. Where do you? I cannot help but wonder where one gets these diplomatic sheer see-through garments. I could think that perhaps you could call it George's secret, or well, who knows, maybe Candy's secret. George's secret is even more ludicrous. Why then do policymakers and diplomats, followed by the media and with academia in tow, so abuse the fundamentals of their craft? I submit that it is because the craft is a hard one, and doing it badly is easier than doing it well. What is then competent diplomacy? Well, competent diplomacy requires deciding on one's own course of action before making diplomatic contact, rather than during negotiations. In Book 8 of his history, Livy tells us of a meeting of the Latin cities to instruct their joint delegation for a meeting with the Romans, who were quite angry with the Latins at that time. And so the Latins were trying to figure out some way of avoiding what usually happened to people in fights with Romans. After much wrangling, one Lucius Annius, who is unknown to history except for this remark, said, quote, "How we act will affect the main issue more than what we say. Once we have set our plans in order, it will be easy to find words to fit our deeds," unquote. That is a fairly easy lesson to understand, but a difficult one to practice. Jobs in policy making have always been naturally attractive, but making hard choices is naturally unattractive. That's why Adamses, Churchills, and de Gaulles are less common than Bushes and Clintons and Kissingers. I can think of no livelier, more diametric contradiction of Lucius's insight than U.S. diplomacy prior to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. By asking European governments to support a decision that the U.S. government had not taken, or claimed not to have taken, and the taking of which it said was predicated on the support that was being requested, U.S. diplomats advertised their government's aimlessness and fecklessness while raising doubts about its sincerity. Second, competent diplomacy means figuring out what the available terms might be. Doing this requires some creativity, and let me give you an example of this creativity. It is from Thucydides, and it comes in the person of Brasidas and his conquest, as he conquered Thrace, largely through diplomacy. In short, Brasidas made offers that the others couldn't refuse. Anyone reading that and having read The Godfather will recognize a certain kinship. Making offers the other side can't refuse. These are models of diplomatic solvency, of inferiority of things asked to positive and negative incentives for granting the requests, soft words and big sticks. Brasidas asked for little. He passed through neutral territory with a small force after professing friendship on the border and getting those who had stopped him to go home for consultation. On his way to Amphipolis, the home of the Athenian garrison in Thrace, he secured the nominal alliance of cities. He needed no more and asked for no more. He didn't ask to station troops inside, didn't ask for levies of those troops from those cities. He offered friendship, he offered trade, and he held in his hand the power to destroy their year's harvest, which he would have done, he said, if they spurned his friendship. Why not take the hand of friendship and gather your crops? When he got to Amphipolis, he seized the outlying farms by surprise, and then, knowing that an Athenian relief force was nearby, he offered the citizens of Amphipolis and the Athenian garrison there the easiest possible terms. Everyone would get to keep his political rights, his life, his property. No one would get hurt in the slightest. Anyone who chose to leave could leave with whatever he wanted to take. All he wanted to do was to cut the alliance with Athens. That's all he wanted. And who would have risked his life and certainly lost his property in order to maintain the alliance with Athens? Very few. The city fell to him without a fight. Again, he made an offer. He made offers that were very, very difficult to refuse. This is and I could find really no better example of the concept of concrete example of the concept of solvency in diplomacy. By the way, the subject of solvency in diplomacy is very well known. It is certainly the theme of Norman Graebner's works on American diplomacy, but it is forgotten. You really do have to have more on your side going for you than against you by a substantial margin in any diplomatic negotiations. Otherwise, you really are quite wasting your time and setting yourself up for failure. Going on diplomatic fishing expeditions is a very, very bad idea. Now, third, in the balance of incentives, an edge in the capacity to instill fear usually outweighs positive factors. Again, consider Thucydides. As the Athenians were trying to round up Sicilian allies against Syracuse, which they were besieging, they told the people of neighboring Camarina that siding with Athens would free them from their ancient hegemon, Syracuse. And that Athens could not take up the role that Syracuse had played, could not oppress them the way Syracuse had, because Athens was too far away to do that. So Athens was offering freedom. By contrast, Syracuse's Hermocrates offered no positive incentives at all. He told, very harshly, he told the Camarinians that it is the fate of small cities, of small powers, to be under the thumb of big ones. You are going to be under the Athenians, or you are going to be under us. There's no difference, he said. He says, but there is a difference. We live here. And if you side with Athens now, no matter what happens, we will never, ever forget our hatred for you. And we will, his threat was brutal, his threat was, it hardly had to be voiced, you see. The Cameroonians, even John Quincy Adams would have said, the Cameroonians would know that anyway, that here is the city. It's not going away. It's not going to be completely razed to the ground. They'll be around, and they'll be around to kill us. If and when they get that chance, not if, because someday they will. Finally, contrary to popular opinion, diplomacy is not about tricks, lies, bluffs, or misrepresentations. All of these have short legs. It is about representing reality in precise words on which all may rely, and of course on the compelling qualities of the things that the words represent. Reputations for reliability are hard won and easily lost. Hence, it is incumbent on a diplomat to brandish only consequences that follow naturally from events, the fulfillment of which is in his country's interest and capacity, which it intends and may not even be able to avoid. In short, to warn but never, ever, ever to threaten. Now, let me turn to war. The questions, what are we after? What are they after? Are essential to warfare as to diplomacy. They are the first step in war, as in diplomacy. Regarding these questions, what are we after? What are they after? Through the optic of Clausewitz's observation that war is politics by violent means, Western students of war have tended to understand the objectives of war as Clausewitz did in terms of contemporary Western politics. What are the objectives of policy? Well, I suggest to you that is far too narrow a view, because the objectives of peoples really transcend the objectives of contemporary Western politics. The essence of war, what Clausewitz called total war, really is much broader. And war can be much more total, very different from the European 19th century variety. Readers on war are hard put to fit, say, the Old Testament's description of Joshua's and the Judges' campaigns into Clausewitzian categories. Like the Saxon tribes' invasion of England, or for that matter, the 19th century Wahhabi invasions of the Shia shrine cities of present-day Iraq, these campaigns aim simply at annihilation. Calling annihilation politics takes some stretching. And while we could say, in retrospect, that Europe's 16th century wars of religion were really about politics, that was by no means clear to the participants. During those years also, bands of heretics, the Albigensians, the Taborites, several other sects, fought major battles with various feudal levies. Were these wars or insurrections? It doesn't matter. The point is that the notion of war must encompass realities far, far greater, far more daunting than the day-to-day political differences among Western countries. Indeed, one can argue that although one could understand World War II in the Pacific in terms of in purely Clausewitzian categories, one would be hard put to understand Hitler's war in Clausewitzian categories. Stalin's war is another matter, but Hitler's war is very difficult to understand in Clausewitzian categories. Answering the questions, what are we after and what are they after, is war's primordial prerequisite. At the outset of the Peloponnesian War, Archidamos, king of Sparta, asked his people, what is to be our war? Meaning, how are we going to beat Athens? The history of that war, however, shows that neither Archidamos nor anybody else asked explicitly the truly primary question. What is to be our peace? What is to be our peace? What is the state of rest at which we're aiming? The state of rest in which we can be satisfied? Because war is going to end. And you can only understand what you are doing, you can only understand the means you are going to undertake in terms of the end that you are seeking. Only in terms of that end can we figure out which defeats we can inflict on the enemy to get what we're after. It turned out in the Peloponnesian War that neither side having a vision of peace, the war turned into an end in itself that ruined everybody. Everybody lost in the Peloponnesian War. Both sides ended up losing, diminished. Both sides had a chance, had many chances for peace. Neither side took those chances because they really didn't understand, did not have foremost in their mind what they were after. In the same manner, Napoleon should not be seen as a great man of war. He was certainly a great man of battle. He was a winner of battles. But de Gaulle pointed out that by striking with France's sword continuously, he broke it. He didn't know where to stop. And therefore, his exertions, or rather the exertions he imposed upon France, ended up doing France no good. You see. So he was not really waging war. Only from the perspective of the peace you desire is it possible to identify what stands in the way. The people, the institutions, the removal of which will give you the peace you want and let you move on to other things. That is the enemy. What is the enemy? The enemy is that which, if removed, will give you the peace you want. Only once you have figured that out does it make sense to think of whom to kill, what to destroy, and then sequentially to ask what will it take, and hence to design military operations. Let me dwell on this for just a moment. Think of what I've just said in relation to the present so-called war on terror. Who is the enemy? Who are those whose death and destruction will give us the peace that we want? You know as well as I do that the subject has not been raised. The President declared war on an abstract noun. First, a single abstraction, terrorism, which at least refers to a method of warfare, and then a double abstraction, extremism, which is, of course, a complete nonsense word. I will, if you want, I'll talk about that later. But the point is that none of these words point to any people or things who, if destroyed, will give us the peace we want. Hence, how is someone rationally supposed to figure out military operations that will, in fact, win the war? It is absolutely impossible. War cannot be made on abstractions. Wars can only be made on concrete things, people. Nor can wars be won by occupations. Again, that kicks the decision can down the road. Who in this occupation is to be advantaged? Who disadvantaged? Disadvantaged extremists? Which ones? There are extremists on all sides fighting one another. Where is the interest? Whom do we kill? There was a testimony last April by the former commanding general of the Army War College. I'm a member of the board of visitors of it, and I've reproached him for it. Robert Scales, in which he said that it's terribly important to know whom we should kill, and we really can't do anything unless we know that. And that decision now has had to filter down to soldiers on the ground in the field. I suggest to you that this amounts to passing the buck downward The decision of whom to kill is a primordial strategic decision. It is a tactical decision, and to push it off on tactical commanders is, it is as good a decision of incompetence, of strategic incompetence, as one could possibly find. And more to the point of my presentation here, it negates the meaning of war. Yeah. War is not that. Yeah. That's not what the word means. Now, moving on, this point, the point of deciding what will it take, the point of designing military operations, is the point at which the arts of war and diplomacy diverge. Recall that perpetually diplomats have the option of walking away from their engagements. But once war's killing starts, the options narrow down to two. There are not three options in wars there are in diplomacy. There are only two: victory and defeat. That is why it is so important, before entering into a war, be it strictly defensive, to calculate what will it take to pay the price for victory, and whether you are ready, willing, and able to pay the price for victory. If you are not, Machiavelli advises in his discourses, you should avoid fights, even by negotiating preemptive surrenders. Negotiating a surrender, a preemptive surrender, before the fighting starts, keeps your forces out of situations they can't control or won't control. It avoids routes. It maintains control over the situation. It is worth the price, says Machiavelli. Once the fighting starts, passions and hatreds eliminate that option. Pericles made that clear to the Athenians when he said to them, as they were grumbling about their former decision to go to war, to recede is no longer possible. For what you hold is, to speak somewhat plainly, a tyranny. To take it perhaps was wrong, but to let it go is unsafe. In the course of war, any limits you may set on your pursuit of victory are actually limits on your commitment to your own peace. You say you're not willing to contemplate wholesale slaughter? Perhaps you want a negotiated solution? Remember, once it becomes clear that you will not do what is needed to win, those negotiations become about the price you must pay for defeat. Note, however, that the price of defeat is inherently less calculable than the price of victory. Much less calculable. Consider, in November 1918, Germany did not imagine the political and economic burdens that would be placed on it by the Versailles Treaty. But the armistice had put Germany at the Allies' mercy, and after it had given up its border forces, it could no longer bargain. It had nothing left to bargain with. It was at the mercy of the winner's variable mercy, and that mercy varied. This can happen informally as well. And, of course, assorted jackals can feed on defeated carcasses quite as well as lions, indeed more eagerly. So what will it take to remove the enemy's obstruction to our peace? How much killing has any side to do to end the war? Well, that depends, first of all, on what the enemy is after, on his character, and on one's own objectives. Very few people ever fight to the last man. Even the Japanese on Okinawa surrendered after they sickened of suicide, after they saw that the Americans were sparing captives. Japan's emperor and his people eventually accepted the shattering of their sacred myths. On the other hand, Germany's Nazis chose a Götterdämmerung. And indeed, they went out of their way to destroy their own society. What will it take? The answer, of course, is that it will take different things with different enemies under different situations. That's perfectly clear. What isn't clear is whether you are willing to do what it takes in any given situation. Whether you realize clearly that not being willing to do what it takes means putting yourself in the position of paying an incalculable, quite literally non-calculable price for defeat. At best, we can control what we are after. A country bent on exterminating peoples from which enmity arises must expect all of its victims to die fighting. One that is bent on desecrating another's way of life must expect having to kill more than one that aims to undo merely an enemy regime, simply because fewer people have a life or death investment in regimes than in sacred ways. And of course, since regimes' roots run unequally deep, eradicating one regime will be more or less bloody business than eradicating another. When, however, one's contemptible reputation inflames enemy passions, only much, much blood can quench them. So the question arises, how much continues to arise? How much killing will it take? Killing only, or first, those most responsible for the enemy's enmity should minimize war's gore. That is why assassinating enemy leaders often is the most just and the most economical of all war measures. That is also why ordinary soldiers are taught to shoot at officers rather than enlisted, and not to waste effort on enemy civilians. But of course, the nexus between the enemy and his civilian base has always been the key, and dealing with that has always been problematic. Prudent commanders always confront the dilemma of making war on the enemy's civil society, thereby ensuring its enmity, or sparing the enemy's civil society in the hope of separating enemy leaders from it. But of course, that decreases the incentives for that separation. Rome's classic epic, the Aeneid, dealt with this problem. Aeneas' enemy, Turnus, was ensconced in a Latin city whose brotherhood the future Romans sought. This is of course entirely mythical, but that of course is the point. You see that this was prototypical. This didn't happen, but this is the way that the great poet of the Roman Empire, of the successful Roman Empire, saw the way that Rome should deal with civilians, enemy civilians in time of war. Turnus was ensconced in the city, and mere entreaties did not lead the Latins to separate themselves from him. The more Aeneas professed and practiced restraint, the more firmly the city held on to Turnus. Only after Aeneas started slaughtering the city did it separate itself from Turnus and expose him to his fate. Only then did Aeneas' clemency have its intended effects. So how much killing does it take? The American South was lucky. Only 3% of its men died in the Civil War. In the 17th century, between a third and a half of the population of central Germany perished. In the ancient world, wars often ended with all men on the losing side killed, all women and children sold into slavery. And many others, the winners didn't bother enslaving, they just killed everybody. Rome erased Carthage because it could not rest in peace in its own mind so long as Carthage existed. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, the tribes of West Africa fought each other to sell each other to Arab slave wholesalers. The cruelest wars, however, have accompanied revolutions. Thucydides shows us how Corsair's factions lived only to annihilate one another. We will never know how many multiples of millions died so that Stalin could achieve his collectivization and die in bed. Recall that millions of Arabs danced in the streets at the sight of Americans burning alive as they dropped from the burning Twin Towers. So what will it take? What will it take to turn such revelers into mourners, turn people like that into, well, into people who are willing to do what the Japanese were doing. Recall that the Japanese used to glory in many a Japanese home had, I think they probably still have them, but they have them in the closet now, pictures of their favorite son hacking off the head of some helpless person. They consider that glorious, inspiring, as giving meaning to life, just as some Arabs consider the death of Americans under torture, the beheading of Americans, to be vivifying, inspiring, a religious, transcendental experience. What does it take to turn people like that into Japanese, or at least with the outward attitudes of Japanese? How much killing does it take? It is impossible to say beforehand. The only question that war asks is, are you willing to do it? Well, it seems to, are you willing to do what it takes? Are you willing to set up the situation so that the answer is favorable to you? Is a question which is common to both war and diplomacy. The means of war are different from the means of diplomacy, but I think I've made the case that the intellectual processes of war and diplomacy are one and the same. It is a question of presenting presenting compulsive realities, compelling realities. Compulsive, that's another story. Compelling realities, either verbally or in fact. Nevertheless, as I say, the objective is the same, and the essence of both processes is the concatenation of ends and of means. That's it. I will now take your questions.
Thank you, Professor Codevilla. The first question goes to Ben King from Reynoldsburg High School in Ohio.
Going back to your discussion of diplomatic charades, even if both sides don't have clear matching objectives and they perhaps don't really have any intention to negotiate towards any lasting peace, is not having committed to the process at least causing a truce and maybe avoiding war, at least temporarily?
You say having committed to what?
I mean, even if it's a ruse to say we have a road
map, well,
we have
the
a
question
process,
is,
at least they're not fighting.
The ruse may, the very meaning of the word ruse is that it is in fact not a sincere agreement, that it is in fact a ploy, and one then must ask, what is the purpose of the ploy? If the purpose of the ploy is in fact not to fight, then it is no ruse at all. Then it is simply an indication that of goodwill, in which case one is in fact negotiating for agreement. But if the purpose of the ruse is to gain time so that additional pressures can be brought, the one who accepts the ruse, in effect, is giving up something of value in exchange for what? In exchange for being put in a worse position.
I understand, perhaps both sides, the Arabs and the Israelis have no intention of actually seriously changing their positions. But nonetheless, is an intractable position like that bettered by the fact that at least they're attempting or saying that they're negotiating?
Well,
as opposed to more violence.
Look, let me ask you, have any of the sides changed their position by talking? I mean, what does the talking represent? See, my point is that talk is meaningful for what it represents. Now, you seem to be avoiding the question of what reality may lie behind the talk, whereas I'm continually asking, why are they doing this? Now, I don't want to get to the remark attributed to Metternich on the death of the Russian ambassador during the 1815 peace conference, Vienna Peace Conference. I wonder what was his objective. Not going that far. Nevertheless, I suggest that it is imperative to ask, what are these people doing? What's going on here? I'll give you an example. Between 1954, yes, and 1967, the U.S. government had something like 151 negotiating sessions with the government of Communist China. Most of the sessions were ritual exchanges of denunciations. They were not negotiating sessions at all. What was the purpose of maintaining this contact? Some say that it was in order to allow both sides perhaps to communicate. In fact, communication was taking place through other means. And indeed, when the diplomatic revolution of 1967-68 occurred, I'm sorry, I didn't say 67, I meant to say 1969. When the diplomatic revolution of 1969 occurred, it did not happen at those talks. Those talks were irrelevant to the diplomatic revolution that occurred. It was nothing that anyone said that caused the quasi-alliance of the United States and China. There were 53 good reasons for that quasi-alliance, and they all spoke Russian, and they all were armed with nuclear weapons. They were all on the Amur River. They were armored divisions, so armored and infantry divisions armed with nuclear weapons on the Amur River. That's what caused the diplomatic revolution, not anything like that. The rule of diplomacy is that those who ask for talks, the demandeurs, are willing to pay something for those talks. And wise powers demand a price. And those who ask are conscious of the price they must pay. In other words, diplomatic meetings are not for the exchange of pleasantries. They are business sessions. And those who go into them thinking anything other than they are business sessions are not just fooling themselves, they're harming their own country.
We have a question from David Fawcett in the Webb Schools in California.
People seem to enter into negotiations knowing full well that they're going to be fruitless, but they enter into them anyway. And it seems to me that what's starting out as a rationale to dismember the State Department and fire all the Foreign Service kind of abstracts from the larger context that you engage in negotiations not only for, say, peace in our time, but you're keeping also in mind the political expectations at home. And I wondered if you would comment on that. The second question is, how do we relate all of this, or how would you suggest that perhaps is the most effective way of conveying your lessons here to our charges in the classroom?
First question, excellent question. So long as one is conscious that in fact the negotiations, and that almost always happens, that's almost always the case, that those who enter into negotiations are almost always are conscious of the effects that this will have on the home public. So long as one is conscious of it and treats it with malice aforethought, i.e. with purposefully, then by all means, realizing, of course, that one is negotiating for side effects. What is the side effect? The side effect would have to, the rational side effect would have to be the strength in one's own side, one's own support among one's own public. For example, if the U.S. government were to enter into negotiations with Iran, by the way, this is something I do not advocate. As a matter of fact, I would be against this course of action, but it would be a rational course of action. If the U.S. government intended to attack Iran, for example, or do something, or even something less, a blockade with Iran, it could enter into very public negotiations with Iran on settling all of the outstanding differences between the countries. It would not begin by granting the Iranian government bona fides, any kind of bona fides, but would stipulate that would in fact begin with a question, and during the negotiations would release the kind of communiques, leaks, etc., that would cast the Iranian government into an increasingly hostile light. On the basis of that buildup, of which the atmospherics generated by the U.S. government with regard to Iran would be part, the government would be strengthened. The U.S. government would be strengthened in taking the measures it would desire. What usually happens is the opposite. What usually happens is one enters into negotiations, granting bona fides to the other side, as for example we do with North Korea, and then we are treated to spectacles such as that of Mr. Gallucci, the State Department's negotiator with regard to North Korea, who is saying that because the North Koreans have given some assurances concerning one nuclear installations, the North Korean nuclear program really must be under control. Well, that is of course a straightforward falsehood. But the interesting question for us is why the falsehood? I mean, far be it from me to accuse Mr. Gallucci of treason or anything of the sort. I'm simply pointing out that he and his superiors in the State Department have put themselves in a position where if they don't accredit every step as progress, everything that happens as progress, they are impeaching their original judgment, their own original judgment, you see. So that's, sure, you can go into negotiations conscious that you are negotiating for side effects and determined to get the most out of those side effects. Sure, you can do that. My point is simply that you've got to realize what it is you're doing. How do you communicate this to students? Well, there are plenty of good old texts on diplomacy. You know, diplomacy is an old art. Harold Nicholson books on diplomacy are excellent. Freddie Clay's book, as I say, has been used by diplomatic academies around the world. Read those books and take them seriously, rather than follow or become part of the loose talk tradition, which unfortunately has become the dominant tradition.
We have a question from Colonel George Kakaisen from North Airedale High School in North Carolina.
Thank you. Professor, given the idea that the war on terrorism is an abstract thought or philosophy,
Right.
To whom do you go to negotiate a peace? And following that up, since it seems that the main strategic objective, if you will, of Al-Qaeda is the destruction of Western civilization as we know it, where would the negotiators come from, and how would they open those negotiations?
Very good. Your question contains a whole bunch of premises. First of all, that the problem of terrorism is somehow synonymous with this thing called Al-Qaeda. And that is by no means the case. let me now put on my intelligence hat for a moment. I would no more credit the popular version of Al-Qaeda than I would stories concerning the Easter Bunny. The amount of information, of hard information we have on that is minuscule. There's an awful lot of third-hand reporting, an awful lot of stuff from Arab liaison services. We have almost no direct information on that. It's nearly all inferred and nearly all from corrupt sources. Certain things we do know. That most of the terrorists come out of either Saudi Arabia itself or movements that are funded directly or indirectly from Saudi Arabia or other places very much like it. The movement is almost exclusively a Sunni movement, and it is almost exclusively associated with the Wahhabi sect, which is part and parcel of the Saudi royal family. If the Saudi royal family were to shut down Wahhabism, first of all, it couldn't do it because it's like someone being asked to shut down his lungs or his stomach. It is an organic part of that regime. It would be different. But in fact, much of the world terrorism movement is animated by the Wahhabi sect. This is a problem not just for the West. It is also primordially a problem for the Muslim world and for the Shia world within Islam. At this point, it is not feasible for us to even think of any kind of negotiated settlement of this war. One must think first of suppressing those sources, because no one in those sources is capable of shutting it down. However, that said, the fact is that these people do not come from Mars. They all live in governments. They all live in places whose governments are not at all liberal, in places where, as Thomas Friedman, who sometimes writes good things in the New York Times, not often, but sometimes he writes them, says, terrorism, he says, is what governments, 98% of terrorism, he says, is what governments want to happen or allow to happen. So ultimately, the practical approach, diplomatic approach to terrorism, seems to me should be that which John Quincy Adams took with regard to the terrorism that was being waged against the state of Georgia by a mixed group of people operating out of Spanish Florida. They went into Florida and hanged a bunch of people and told Spain that it would get Florida back if and when they controlled Florida in a way that did not allow any trouble to come from it to Georgia.
That has serious repercussions, though, when you kind of apply that to Saudi Arabia.
It does. There is absolutely nothing unserious about war. And to take war, this is why I repeated about 15 times, what will it take? You really must, if you're serious, you must ask, what will it take? And if you are not willing to do what it takes, then it is incumbent upon you to sue, to go to those who are somehow responsible and ask them, what can I do? Yeah. Will you give me a price? Of course, they may give you a price, you may pay it, and they may renege on you. In which case, you've got the same problem you had before, only worse. I mean, these are very serious things. And anyone who tells you that they've got an easy solution, which Not so. The solution becomes more and more difficult as the country shows itself less and less able to deal with its problems. And as I say, war consists of those activities which end the war. If the occupation of, and therefore things like occupations generally do not end wars. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that the occupation of Iraq went precisely the way the administration wanted it. What difference would it make? I suggest not much. Indeed, you see. Therefore, one would say, well, then why are you doing that and not what it takes? Well, because going to Saudi Arabia, that would be a real problem. Yes, indeed it would. Yes, indeed it would. No argument about that. Are you then willing to forego your own peace? Perhaps you are. Are you sure that this is all you're giving up? Are you sure the price isn't going to rise? What will you do next year? What will you do after the next attack? What then? You see. So there's a logic. There's a logic to war, and it's very, very harsh.
One final question from P.J. Chagan of the American Academy in Pennsylvania.
My question, Dr. Codevilla, is does this type of honest talk / diplomacy lead us to a kind of nuclear brinksmanship? And does it lead to nuclear proliferation, or do you feel that that's happening anyway, and what we really have is a nuclear brinksmanship without any honesty?
Well, as far as just very quickly deal with the issue of nuclear proliferation, I don't know of any possible way of stopping nuclear proliferation. I don't think anyone else does either. There is a logic to weaponry, which has operated ever since the dawn of history, that the unusual becomes commonplace. Anyone who has been to an American university and sees who, in fact, is studying in the departments of physics, chemistry, etc., and mathematics, will notice that most of the people there don't look like most of the people in this room. Nearly all of them speak funny. They tend to be generally better and work harder than people who don't speak funny. So anyone who thinks, and by the way, the tools that are available for building nuclear weapons today, especially the computers, are infinitely better than the ones with which we built the arsenal that we now have. So nuclear, of course there's nuclear proliferation. Will Iran have nuclear weapons? Of course it will. Don't even think otherwise. The question is, how are you going to handle the situation? As for any disadvantage that honesty and talk might bring, I suggest it is less than the advantage of not facing issues honestly. There was a commercial on TV for Fram oil filters. You can pay me now, or you can pay me later.
Okay, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Professor Codevilla. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Colonel Herbert to make some announcements and walk you through the rest of the events of today.